47 pounds of tomatoes, that was my ceiling. Year after year, same raised bed, same 4x8 footprint. Same 40 to 50 pounds, no matter what I tried. I composted, I rotated crops, I side dressed with fish emulsion in July, just like every book told me to. In my personal harvest logs, which I've maintained for nearly 2 decades, I noticed a frustrating pattern every October. I'd stand there with my kitchen scale and a notebook, writing down almost the exact same number I wrote the year before. 18 years of that, 18 seasons watching the same soil turn a shade grayer, compacting a little tighter under my knees each spring, crumbling a little less when I squeezed it in my fist. I told myself that was normal. I kept records: 20 pounds of peppers, 15 to 20 pounds of beans. Looking back at my data archives, the numbers were so consistent. They looked photocopied from one harvest log to the next. And I wore that consistency like a badge, thought I was doing something right. Took me almost 2 decades to realize consistent mediocrity isn't mastery. It is a symptom. The soil under my beds had lost its charge. Not metaphorically, literally, healthy ground carries measurable electrical conductivity. I didn't know this until a 70-year-old man walked into my yard, holding a spool of copper wire and a handful of brass fittings. He said he could triple my harvest, and I almost laughed. I'd been gardening longer than some of my neighbors had been alive. I had spreadsheets, I had data. But something in the way he talked made me pause. He wasn't selling anything, he wasn't pitching a product. He just pointed at my beds and said the soil looked tired. Said it the way a mechanic says your battery is dead. Not a judgment, a diagnosis, and the worst part was I already knew it. In my seasonal observations, I'd watched my tomato leaves yellow earlier every August. A decline I had previously misattributed to simple aging. So when he offered to build something in my garden for free, something he called an atmospheric energy collector, I didn't say yes because I believed him. I said yes because after 18 years of doing everything right and getting the same tired results, I was ready to admit the truth. The whole framework I'd been operating inside might be the problem. Not my effort, not my timing, not my seed selection. Here is the conclusion I've reached after analyzing nearly 20 years of synthetic inputs. Nobody told me when I started buying bags of fertilizer every spring that every single granule I shook onto that raised bed was a little white lie. Just a lie dressed up as plant food. I spent 18 years feeding my soil the way the bag told me to. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, the holy trinity printed on every label. In every garden aisle, in every big box store from here to the coast. And for 18 years, my yields stayed flat. 40-something pounds of tomatoes, maybe 20 pounds of peppers. Never more, never less. I thought that was the ceiling. I thought that was just what a 4x8 bed could do. It wasn't. That bed was starving, and I was the one starving it. In my research into soil microbiology, I found a dark truth. What synthetic fertilizer actually does underground is never printed on the packaging. The moment those salts dissolve, they short-circuit the fungal network down there. Mycorrhizal fungi, the thread-like organisms that connect root systems to nutrients. They shut down when they detect a chemical shortcut. Why would a root maintain a relationship with a fungal partner? Not when free nitrogen is flooding the zone. So the fungi retreat, the network thins. I've documented this transition. You are no longer gardening in living soil anymore. You are gardening in a sterile medium that cannot feed a plant. Unless you keep buying the next bag. That is the dependency loop. Fertilizer kills the biology that makes fertilizer unnecessary. Then you need more fertilizer. Then the biology dies further. Then you need even more. I did the math once. Over 18 years, I spent somewhere around $900 on fertilizer, potting mix, and so-called nutrient-rich amendments. $900 to maintain a harvest I could have bought for less. And the whole time I thought I was doing it right. Because the soil looked dark and the label said organic blend. And the tomatoes still turned red, they just never turned abundant. Tilling was the other silent killer. Every March I would flip that bed with a fork, feel productive. What I now identify as a critical error was ripping apart the fungal highways. Highways that had spent all winter slowly rebuilding. One afternoon of turning soil can destroy months of biological recovery. But every gardening book I owned said to do it. Every video showed a guy with a broad fork smiling like he unlocked the secret. He didn't. He just reset the clock on his own soil to 0. And then there is the herbicide drift nobody talks about in suburban neighborhoods. My neighbor 2 doors down sprays his lawn every 6 weeks. In my detailed tracking of soil toxicity, I've seen how that mist travels. It does not stop at his property line, it settles on my mulch, soaks into my bed edges, and quietly suppresses the microbial populations. Populations I never even knew I needed. I was blaming my seeds, blaming my watering schedule, blaming the weather. I never once looked at the system itself. So, when my neighbor walked over that Saturday morning with a wooden dowel, some copper wire and a brass stake, I almost laughed. $15 of hardware store, scraps against 18 years of store-bought soil science. But he said something that stuck with me. He said the fertilizer industry had no reason to promote something free. Atmospheric energy, electrical charge already sitting in the air, already cycling through every storm and every temperature swing, costs nothing. You cannot patent it, you cannot bag it, you cannot put a barcode on it. And that is exactly why it got buried. He told me farmers in the 1920s and 30s already knew this. They called it electroculture, copper antennas collecting charge, feeding it into the ground, waking up the very microbiology that chemical agriculture spends billions suppressing. Then the fertilizer boom hit, and those studies disappeared like they never happened. Not because they failed, because they worked and they were free. I began to document the implementation of this experiment last spring. I watched him wrap that copper coil around the dowel, drive it into the center of my bed, and connect it to a brass stake. Total install time, 45 minutes. Total cost, $17. And for the first 2 weeks, nothing, absolutely nothing. I planted my tomatoes, my peppers, my beans, same spacing, same water. No fertilizer this time, just bare soil and a strange copper stick poking out of the middle of the bed like some kind of garden scarecrow. I almost pulled it out twice, but by week 3 I recorded a visible anomaly. The plants closest to that antenna were visibly larger. And I do mean measurably larger, not wishful thinking larger. So I grabbed a tape measure instead of a bag of fertilizer. And what I found made me furious at every dollar I had already spent. 12 pounds of tomatoes in a single week from 3 plants. That number still sits in my head. Because I pulled barely 4 pounds from the identical variety growing 6 feet away. Same soil, same water, same hands. The only variable was proximity to a piece of copper sticking out of the ground. And when I saw that gap, I stopped thinking about the antenna and started investigating the biological exchange happening underneath it. Here is what nobody explains when they talk about soil. We treat dirt like a dead container. You fill it with nutrients, you stick a plant in, you hope for the best. But from my perspective, soil is not a container, it is a city. 1 teaspoon of healthy ground holds more living organisms than there are people on this planet. Picture it like this: a plant pushes sugars out through its roots. Not by accident, on purpose, those sugars are a paycheck. Bacteria show up to collect, and in exchange, they break down minerals. Minerals the plant cannot access on its own. Fungi arrive next, threading hair-thin filaments called hyphae through the soil, sometimes stretching hundreds of feet from a single root tip. Those filaments connect plant to plant, tree to seedling, like a fiber optic network buried just below the surface. I've followed the research from the University of British Columbia that mapped this. They found that a single mother tree can be linked to dozens of younger plants through fungal threads, sharing phosphorus, nitrogen, even chemical warning signals when pests attack. An underground internet running on barter instead of bandwidth. Now, here is where the copper comes back in. When I sent soil samples to a lab, the findings were staggering. The composition near the antenna and the bed edge came back nearly identical. It had the exact same organic matter and the exact same pH. But one line on the report caught my eye. Electrical conductivity was measurably higher in the soil closest to the antenna. That mattered because the fungal network I just described does not run on magic. It runs on electrochemical gradients, ion exchange, tiny voltage differences that pull nutrients along those hyphae, just the way current moves through a wire. The effect got stronger after thunderstorms, and my neighbors were right, I watched it happen. 2 days after a heavy storm in late May, the tomato plants within 3 feet of the antenna pushed out a visible growth spurt. The atmospheric charge from the storm fed into the copper. The copper channeled it into the soil. and the fungal web distributed it outward like a root-level power grid. By early June, my experimental data was conclusive. Plants within 3 feet of the antenna measured 45% larger than baseline. Between 3 and 5 feet, 20% larger, and beyond 5 feet was normal. A perfect gradient, fading with distance. Exactly the way a signal weakens as you move from a router. The zone of influence was roughly a 5-foot radius. Inside that radius, the soil food web was operating on a higher gear. Bell peppers hit 8 to 10 ounces each, with walls so thick they snapped when I bent them. Beans produced continuously for 8 straight weeks. 28 pounds from the antenna zone versus 9 pounds from the outer rows. 3 to 1 over and over, every crop and every way in. This is not some fringe theory. This is a biological operating system that was running long before we showed up. Before we showed up with our pellets and our spray bottles. We just forgot the access code. And the real question, the one that kept me up past midnight, staring at my own harvest log, is what happens when you stop just boosting the signal and start designing an entire bed around this network from the ground up. I am genuinely curious about your observations. Has anyone else noticed their plants behave differently after a storm? Even without any antenna in the ground? Drop that in the comments because I have a theory about why. And I want to see if your experience lines up with mine before sharing. 201 pounds from 12 square feet. 78 pounds from 20. I sat with those numbers for a long time after that first season, because they broke something in my head. The bed closest to that copper coil wasn't getting extra water or extra compost. It wasn't getting anything I would normally call effort. And yet it was outproducing the rest of the garden by nearly 4 to 1. On a per square foot basis, the total harvest from that single raised bed hit 279 pounds. My running average for the same bed over 18 years of longitudinal records was exactly 85 pounds. That is 3.2 times my normal yield. And the only variable I changed cost me $15 and about 20 minutes of my afternoon. I spent the entire off-season after that trying to poke holes in what I had already documented. I pulled old research papers from the 1920s and 30s, back when universities actually studied electrical stimulation in agriculture. Turns out, dozens of researchers had already documented the same thing. Small electrical currents in soil made roots more aggressive. Nutrient uptake went up, disease resistance climbed, microbial activity accelerated. Bacteria and fungi started breaking down organic matter faster, cycling phosphorus and nitrogen into forms that plant roots could actually grab. The soil was doing more work, not because I added anything to it, but because I gave it a nudge it already knew how to respond to. And then synthetic fertilizers got cheap. The moment you could dump a bag of ammonium nitrate for a few dollars an acre, nobody wanted to hear about copper coils and atmospheric charge. The research dried up, funding disappeared. Electroculture became a footnote, then a punchline, then nothing at all. Not because it failed, but because it couldn't be sold in a bag. This is the part that messed with me the most. I did less. I literally stood a stick in the dirt, wrapped it with 12-gauge copper wire I bought for $8, connected it to a brass rod with a $2 connector, and walked away. No maintenance, no weekly inputs, no foliar sprays, no pH adjustments, no side dressing. I left it in place for the entire growing season, and the system handled the rest. I've recorded the total materials list for those who wish to replicate this experiment. A 6-foot wooden dowel for $3, 20 feet of bare copper wire. An 18-inch brass or copper grounding rod for about $4. A couple of wire connectors, or substitute a brass tent stake, if that is what you have lying around. The only tools involved are a drill or a hammer and wire cutters. The build takes minutes. Wind the wire in a tight spiral from the bottom of the dowel upward, coils about ½ an inch apart. Leave 3 feet of extra wire trailing from the base. Drive the stake 12 inches into the center of your bed. Sink the ground rod 2 feet away, 18 inches deep. Connect the trailing wire to the rod, make sure the contact is solid. And you're done. That is the entire intervention. For a larger garden, space additional antennas about 10 feet apart. But I'd always suggest starting with one. Put it in your most consistent bed, the one where you already know what normal looks like, and keep your records the way you always have. Weigh everything, photograph everything, compare. I ran this setup for 2 full seasons. Both years produced the same dramatic jump. By week 4 of the second year, the plants inside the antenna's radius were already visibly outpacing everything outside it. Same soil, same seed packets, same watering schedule. The only variable was a $15 piece of physics. Sitting quietly in the middle of the bed, doing what the atmosphere and the soil microbiome were always capable of doing. If someone just closed the circuit, that is, the lever, not more labor, not more money. A single, almost free object that reconnects a biological system to an energy source. It lost access to the moment we decided chemistry was easier than ecology. And the wildest part is that you can't patent atmospheric electricity, which is exactly why nobody with a marketing budget will ever tell you. So I'm curious, if you try this, even on one bed, please share your data. Come back and tell me what your numbers looked like. Because mine still don't feel real, and I want to know if yours match. Picture the next supply chain shock. You've seen it before. Empty shelves, triple-digit price tags on wilted lettuce, people shoving each other over the last bag of frozen broccoli. I lived this contrast during the last shortage, and it rewired something in my brain permanently. Now picture yourself walking out your back door, pulling a ripe tomato off the vine, cutting a head of cabbage that weighs more than anything the store carried. Last week, that contrast isn't hypothetical. 2 seasons ago, I was still buying most of my produce. I had a garden, sure, but it was a hobby. Something I did on weekends when the weather cooperated. Then my neighbor stuck that copper antenna in my bed, and the numbers changed so fast, I couldn't ignore what they meant. I saw a single 32 square foot plot feeding me more than 150 pounds of food per season, $15 in materials, no fertilizer bill, no middleman, no truck driver who has to show up on time for me to eat dinner. That is when it stopped being gardening and became something else entirely. I started looking at my backyard through a new lens, the same way you'd look at a savings account during a recession. Every square foot was a deposit. Every technique I'd tested, every failed experiment, every weird old method I documented, they were all compounding. The soil was getting richer each year, not poorer. The microbial networks I'd been feeding were doing work I never had to pay for. My food cost was trending toward zero, while grocery prices climbed in the opposite direction. This isn't about rejecting the modern world. I still go to the store. But the store is no longer the only option. And that single shift changes everything about how you move through a crisis. You just have to stop reacting. I didn't plan to end up here. A skeptic with a copper wire and a notebook. Somehow backed into the oldest form of security humans ever invented. Growing your own food isn't a lifestyle trend. In my ultimate analysis, it is the one asset that can't be inflated away, can't be supply chained into scarcity, and can't be held hostage by a system you never agreed to.